This year's theme for National Crime Victims' Rights Week, rights, access, equity for all victims, underscores the importance of enforcing victims' rights, expanding access to those services, and ensuring equity and inclusion for all. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Aswad Thomas. He's the National Director at Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, a flagship project of the Alliance for Safety and Justice. His story is one of resilience in the face of impossible odds, true empathy beyond comprehension, and leadership in criminal justice reform. Please join me in welcoming Aswad Thomas.
Good evening. Thank you, Chris, and the Office for Victims of Crime for inviting me here today. You know, as I'm standing here on this stage, I must say it's been a long journey. You know, shortly after I graduated from college about 13 years ago, and just days before I was scheduled to move to Europe to start my professional basketball career, I was shot twice in my back in an attempted armed robbery in my neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut. You know, those bullets ended my basketball career and nearly my life. Now, from that moment, you know, for me and my family, everything changed. I was released from the hospital back into my mother's apartment a few blocks from where I was shot. For months, I laid on her living room, on her couch, recovering from 2 gunshot wounds. For months, I laid in constant fear, pain, and trauma. I was grappling with this new grief and trauma. The future that I had worked so hard for on the basketball court, in school, was gone. During that time, the bills were piling up. I felt alone in my anxiety and my fear. And my interactions with the public systems did not help me at all. So I remember law enforcement coming to visit me several times during my recovery, and all the conversations were about the case. And those conversations added to my stress at that time. They never shared any information about the victim compensation program. They never told me about victim assistance. They never even told me about the victim advocate who's in their department. There was no mention of help, no mention of healing for myself, but there's also no expression of concern at all. You know, the hospital did not provide any referrals for me or mention of, just what type of support, financial support, mental health support at all. You know, my family and I, over those past few months, we had to piece our lives back together on our own. And I was lucky. You know, I had a very strong family. I had a very strong community. And even though I was, devastated to start my life over again, you know, I knew that I wanted to help my community. And so I returned back to college, received my master's degree, and became a community organizer. You know, my community saved me at that time, so I was determined to give back to my community. You know, nearly a decade after I was shot, you know, for the first time, I learned of the existence of the victim compensation program or victim assistance programs. And when I found out, I must say, you know, I was stunned that that type of support even existed. You know, I began to think about, was I the only person who's been a victim of a violent crime and did not know anything about victim assistance or victim compensation? And so that started me on this journey to look in my own family. And so I called my father. My father was shot in his chest in the 1980s. And I say, Dad, when you got shot, did you get any help? Did you know about victim assistance? And the answer was no. And so I called my second oldest brother, who was also a victim of gun violence. He was shot in his back in the 1990s, and I asked him that same question, and he said no. And then I called my cousin, who was also shot in the early 2000s, and as a result of that shooting, he's paralyzed from the waist down. And I asked him that same question, did you get any help? Were you made aware of victim assistance? And he said no. So in my immediate family, 5 out of the 10 males are victims of gun violence, and not one of us received compensation or assistance, or was even made aware that assistance existed after we were shot. During that time in my family time, we had plenty of interactions with the justice system, but none that led to help with compensation or recovery for us. But for my family and for millions of people like us, that lack of concern, compensation, or support has long lasting and devastating impacts, far beyond those physical wounds. Job loss, financial debt, housing insecurity, PTSD, isolation, compromised health, and all too often becoming a victim over and over again. See, when victims of violence cannot find help to recover and get to safety, they become more vulnerable and less protected and much less safe. So underneath that grim picture of what happens when victims suffer long-term trauma, there's lies a very uncomfortable conversation, a conversation that is long overdue. Race and socioeconomic status has everything to do with which victims get help and which do not. Had my father, my brother, or myself had not been black males, the chance of being hurt would have been much smaller, and the access to support in the aftermath would have been much greater. And so that must change. And the theme of this year's National Crime Victims' Rights Week is equity. That's a theme that requires those uncomfortable conversations. The issue of equity is about so much more than where victim services are located or who runs these programs. That is important, but there's a much deeper reality that defines who gets help and who does not. This is about seeing the humanity of all victims, victims like me. We know the statistics. The impact of violence is not felt evenly. Young people, people of color, low-income people all face greater vulnerability to becoming hurt by crime. And we know that when victims are victims of crime, they're more likely to become victims again if they don't get access to support and services. But we also know because of those statistics, whose lives have been torn apart by violence, who too often don't receive recognition or even feel honored or have any sense of dignity from those who have neglected them for decades. I have lived that reality my entire life. I've lost more than 40 friends to gun violence. My first experience with violence was when I was only 10 years old. My best friend, Reuben Elder, was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting when he was only 10 years old. After Reuben got killed, there wasn't no grief counselors at school. There was no support for Reuben's family, and it was one of the many homicides that was never solved. Just as there is unequal distribution of who gets hurt, there's unequal access to help. The most harmed are the least helped. And after someone is hurt, at every stage, far too often, there's a lack of dignity or real support. It starts in hospitals and in police stations, which victims are treated with dignity and concern. So what if frontline providers who don't treat victims with dignity and respect, they won't be delivering that vital information to help victims get the help that they need or where to get it. It continues in the policies and regulations that determine who qualifies for help. Once again, it's these uncomfortable conversations that we must have. If victims are lucky enough to hear about victim services, how likely are they able to make those eligibility requirements and get approval? Most everyone I know likely wouldn't have even qualified if they had known about the help, or victims would have known about the process to turn the application in. Most crime victims across this country, through our 90,000 members, majority of them have never received compensation or access to victim services. There's a lot of reasons why people don't qualify for things like victim compensation. There's all the time that law enforcement often deems someone as a possible suspect so that their victim application is often denied. There's all the people that are considered contributing to their own victimization because they were under the influence. There's the people who don't have stable homes or employment records for their application. And still others are often too afraid to even report to law enforcement, so they don't qualify. All of these rules might sound logical in theory, but in practice, they become a wall of exclusions, preventing too many low-income people and people of color from ever being eligible for assistance. And it continues with how limited help is actually provided to crime victims, especially crime victims in communities of color. So even if you are eligible, often you still face the barrier of having to pay up front from submitting for reimbursement, or facing limitations on reimbursement amounts that don't actually reflect the actual cost of things like funerals or housing relocation. And it could take months for the limited funds to even be available while victims are recovering from crime. And if we really want to get serious about equity, we have to get honest about the roadblocks our systems often erect and what roadblocks mean for low-income people and people of color. So simply put, right now, our public safety systems have failed to train first responders to treat all victims with dignity. They have created prerequisites to qualifying for help that exclude the most vulnerable, and have bureaucratic procedures in place that prevent meaningful help from arriving on time, and even for people who qualify. So the consequences of these, unattainable hurdles to help are dire in our communities. I have traveled across the country talking with victims. And for me, the stories are really starting to they're starting to blur together. It's the mother who's been denied money to bury her son because the police report said that her son was a gang member, even though he was not. The father who lost his job after becoming paralyzed and unable to perform those job functions, but was denied victims' compensation because his application was not filled out properly. The young person who is too terrified to report getting jumped to police for fear of retaliation, who was then denied help and continues to live in that constant fear. So the stories go on and have been repeating themselves for decades. As hard it may seem to really face these realities, I would say there's reason for hope. Change has been emerging across the country. In my organization, we train victims and survivors as leaders and as advocates. And we travel together to state houses across the country advocating for law changes. Many states have started to improve their compensation rules and even review the application review procedures. Others are also starting to provide funding for more community-based victim service centers and trauma recovery centers. So my organization has successfully advocated for the establishment of 39 trauma recovery centers from just having one just 8 years ago. These trauma recovery centers are a lifeline for so many survivors, but we only have 39. We need more. It's really time, to overhaul the victims' compensation program and provide more urgent help with less red tape. It's time to provide flexible cash assistance to crime victims up front to help with them with emergencies and help reduce crisis. It's time to build more trauma recovery centers and make sure victims get the long-term help that we need. And it's time to hold our justice system accountable for treating all victims with the respect we all deserve. This is possible to achieve. It's really a matter of political will. The existence of the compensation program and victim assistance programs have grown across the country in the last 40 years. And it emerged out of that urgent political will. So it can be done. And it's urgent that we do so now. Helping victims is helping public safety. A few years after I was shot in Hartford, Connecticut, during my last doctor's appointment, I learned that the young man who shot me had been a victim of gun violence 4 years prior. When he was a victim of gun violence at only 14 years old, there was no victim compensation, there was no victim assistance or trauma recovery for him when he was a victim of gun violence at 14 years old. And like so many, the life that trauma and violence impact so many people, and that lack of help led that young man down that path to pick up a gun 4 years later and nearly taking my life. The system must change. I've often wondered, what would have been like, for him grappling with that pain and that anxiety that I know all too well at only 14 years old. And I wonder, what had happened in his own life? What had happened in mine had he gotten help? Would he have been saved from a life of crime? Would I have been on a basketball court instead of on my mother's couch recovering from those gunshot wounds? So unless we really take seriously providing accessible, competent help to all crime victims, we will never be able to stop the cycle of crime. So this is an audience of people who really care about victims, and you care about safety. You're here for many of you after working tirelessly to help people recover and get their lives back on track. That work is so important. It's critical that you use your voice and influence to make equity in victim services a reality. Communities most impacted by violence are suffering from the ripple effects of violence. We need urgent help now. We cannot wait. Because too many victims do not get compensation. Too many victims do not get mental health services. Too many victims do not get safe housing. And too many organizations that are on the front lines to violence do not get funding. This must change if we're going to talk about equity. So together, I honestly believe that we can build this new vision of safety. But it will require radical rethinking of our policies and our public agencies and our distribution of resources. But if we can get there, if we can lay that foundation for finally achieving true safety and healing for all, I know that we will make all communities safer. So in closing, I want you to think about that young man who shot me. What if he got compensation? What if he got victim services? What if there was a trauma recovery center in my community? I can be honest with you all, I will not be in front of you here today. But unfortunately, I am. Thank you.